All right, 101. Let's talk about Jackson Pollock. And again, one more time, let's just sort of review these core concepts. And in this one, really look for that last concept, right? Understand the transformation of the artwork from picture to thing. And in addition, from product to process. And we'll talk about that toward the end. So here he is, Jackson Pollock. Died unfortunately young. You can see it's from 1912, 1956. He killed himself with alcohol. He was driving drunk and overturned his Oldsmobile and killed himself that way when he was about 44 years old. And we talked about his ideas about painting, that art needs new techniques, right? That new needs new techniques, and the artists of the day can't look back to Renaissance techniques or classic figurative techniques. They have to come up with something entirely new. And of course, by now we know what Jackson Pollock came up with. His drip paintings. And I love talking about Jackson Pollock in a class like this because I think, as I've said before, it really is one of those things that some people look at him and they go, why is this art? Why, these splattered paintings that look like somebody spilled something on the kitchen floor? Why are these considered great works of art? And there's a great deal of legitimate criticism that they shouldn't be. In fact, I pulled one for you here. Robert Coates once derided a number of Pollock's works as, quote, mere unorganized explosions of random energy and therefore meaningless, right? He's saying, well, look, if it's random and it's just sort of, static energy, so to speak, it can't have meaning and it can't be art. And I think that's a pretty interesting critique of it that way. Now, just to address that first thing about it being random, Pollock argues that it's not. Pollock actually said that he has an idea of what he wants this thing to look like when he starts to make it. And he definitely denies the reliance on the accident, right? His technique, as you've seen in the video that we saw before this week, that it was a very sort of active kind of movement around the canvas. As you can see, it was a combination of things he could control, right? How hard he flicked his arm, where he stood, and things he couldn't control, right? The paint after it went flying off, things like that. So there really was this kind of performative aspect to it. But you'll notice that he says there that he would look at the painting and he wouldn't stop until he saw what he wanted to see. So there seems to be some intention in his ideas that way. In fact, he says, the method of painting is the natural growth out of a need. I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them. Express my feelings rather than illustrate them, right? It's not illustration anymore. Technique is just a means of arriving at a statement. I can control the flow of paint. There is no accident, just as there is no beginning and no end. And he's really sort of into that idea as well, right? The paintings they're not telling a story, right? They don't have a narrative form. There's no beginning or end to it, right? It's like a constant state in that way. And I'm going to show you a slide, and since you've seen a painter sort of reproduce how he makes these, I won't talk too much about this, but this is from a famous article that Time Magazine did about, or Life Magazine, I think, did about, no, I think it was Time, did about Pollock in 1950, and they sent a photographer who photographed him actually making a painting and described it to him, as you can see here, and you could see that he sort of, my favorite part of the article is where he describes how Pollock sort of like stops and he looks at this massive drips and splatters, and suddenly he starts and adds more drip splatters there, stops again and looks at, adds more of this in there, and then he finally says, this is it, right? Now it's done. And it was like a mystery to the photographer how he would know if it was done, which of course was also reflected on our podcast that way. But think about that idea, right? That he's not illustrating, he's expressing, right? And that actually reflects what N.C. Wyeth was talking about 50 years before, right? So we see this urge in American artists to move away from illustration towards a much more conceptual expression in their art form. And of course, as we know, it comes down to this. One of my favorite quotes from Jackson Pollock is one of his most simple, right? He says, I am nature. What do you think he means by that? And again, if we were able to do this synchronously, we could discuss this. But think about that, right? Think about it in terms of the classic representation or expression of art or purpose of art that we learned at the very beginning of class, how the Greeks defined mimesis, right? That we have an urge to re-record or represent what we see in the world for certain moral reasons, right? We seek to reproduce nature. Pollock says, I'm not trying to reproduce nature, I am nature, right? He's not making a recording of something else in the world. He's making a brand new thing, right? A thing to be looked at and to be considered on its own terms. And that's really how you have to look at an abstract expressionist painting, right? Is that it's not an image of anything, right? It's not a picture. It's a thing, right? It's not representing some other person in some other world, Christina in her world, right? It's something that you're looking at in real time and having some sort of reaction to, right? Having some sort of it's you know, and it's an attempt by an artist to express that to you. So that's what abstract expressionism comes to be, right? Through that 50 or so years, we see, at least in American painting, where the painters move from creating these representations of the world, of the people, of the happenings in the world, right, to this entirely different thing, right, to the point where, and with Jackson Pollock, they say that it became pure abstraction, right? This doesn't refer to anything in the world, right? It's just a thing in the world that we look at. So that's the idea that generates it. The last question we have is, okay, why did that idea get so popular, so famous, so important, right? How did that idea become the great work of art? And the short answer to that is publicity. And the longer answer is actually fairly interesting, right? What Jackson Pollock and other abstract expressionist artists, and we see Franz Kline here, were doing, right, caught the attention of some newspapers, some magazines in New York City at the time, right? And two rather prominent art critics, Harold Rosenberg and Clement Greenberg, it caught their attention, right? And they both started writing about this new form of art, this abstract expressionism, and saying, hey, this is actually a pretty cool thing that's going on, you know? So they were getting the press that started to make the art world in New York really sort of look at it and create some buzz around it. But then another weird thing happened. Rosenberg and Greenberg, while both thinking it was great new art, right, they thought it was great new art for two entirely different reasons. And they began a series of, they sort of had a public debate in the various magazines and newspapers in New York, arguing back and forth about what abstract expressionism really was. And it was that kind of conflict that they created, that buzz that they created, that really cemented American art generally and abstract expressionism particularly as being one of the leading art forms of the 20th century. And in many ways, it was at that period of time, both because of the painters and writers like Rosenberg and Greenberg, where the center of the art world shifted from Europe, you could argue it was in Paris still at that point, to the United States and to New York City specifically. Here's what they were arguing about. And you can see here that Rosenberg coins the term action painting, and that's very clear, of course, how we see the action that Pollock is putting into making his paintings, right? He's not standing quietly in front of a canvas. He's moving around in this sort of almost dance, as the photographer called it, right? He says, and because of this, Rosenberg redefines the act of painting. He says the canvas is an arena in which to act, right? So Rosenberg's critique, as he says here, Rosenberg's critique shifted the emphasis from the object, right, to the struggle itself. What he was saying essentially was that where the art is not on the surface of the canvas. It's in the process that the painter moves through to make that work, right? To see that work through, to see his idea or his expression to fruition. Right, the canvas is really just sort of a remnant of that experience. Right, the actual work of art is the process by which the canvas is made. And the canvas is just this sort of souvenir we have, right? This, he uses a great term, right? The residue of some process that happened, right? And that process is what art now is, right? The canvas itself is just sort of a receipt for it, if you will, a residue of it. And so, and that's a novel idea, of course, at the time. And as you might argue, as you might guess, Clement Greenberg took the opposite approach. And I should mention, by the way, this is another abstract expressionist at the time, Lee Krasner, who was Pollock's wife and was sort of considered a secondary artist to Pollock at the time. And that may reflect some ideas about it at the time, but has really enjoyed a resurgence of her reputation as being as talented and commanding a painter as the male painters of her era. So she's experiencing a bit of a renaissance in her work, Lee Krasner is. Greenberg, of course, focuses on the painting's objectness. He says essentially to Rosenberg, that's a fun idea, but come on, right? The work of art is the work of art, right? So he takes a more traditional view, right? He says, sure, there's a change in the physicality of the painting, but it's the paint itself that tells us that, right? The oil cake surfaces. That's the key to understanding them, right? The meaning comes from us looking at the object, right? Not understanding the process, right? That's fundamental to art, even though it looks different. And that's an interesting argument if you think about it, right? He's saying, look, yeah, the art looks different now, but how we relate to it hasn't changed, right? That's been the same throughout history, and that's going to stay the same, right? And so that was the debate. And it was that debate, right, that really energized the art market into people sort of talking about things. What is art now? What is it going to be in the future? And it was because of this debate between Rosenberg and Greenberg that abstract expressionist became really the most important kind of work in the world. So that argument and the residue of that argument really, Rosenberg kind of won it, is what ultimately what happened, because his redefinition of what art is as a process, as an act rather than an object, right, became an extraordinarily influential idea. And honestly, I'd say he won for a while. It may be actually moving back toward Greenberg's ideas nowadays, but for the next 30, 40 years after that, right, artists became far more interested in process than in product. It births the idea of performance art, installation art, the earth art that we've seen, right? Carrying stones and creating a residue of something that happens in the environment, as we saw earlier, right? Conceptual art being the idea that if you think about that minimalist box that we saw, right, where the idea of thinking about time, right, understanding the artist's concept and the artist's idea is far more important than that modest little wooden box as an object is, right? And so that's where those ideas come from in modern art, and that's why it was probably one of the most influential and important movements of art practice in the United States and in the world soon after the end of World War II. So let's just sort of finish up really again with just that again, that idea, right? Pollock saying, I am nature, I am making something, because surely he did,